Hi, it's Grandma Karen. Today we will sew on a practice sheet, learning to use the guidelines on the stitch plate. We will also practice sewing on fabric. In this video, we will be looking at the Bernina 335. In the sewing demonstration, you will see a machine that is not your model, but the information will be generic and apply to your machine. We sewed on the lines of these 4 practice sheets in Lesson 4 and 5. You learned how to use your hands, how to change the stitch length, and how to control the speed. You used the line on your presser foot as a guide, but most of the time you will not sew on lines. Today we will learn to sew seams. Sewing seams is what we do most of the time when sewing. A seam is a place where 2 pieces of something meet together. The photos on the left show seams on a table and seams on a floor. In sewing, a seam is where 2 pieces of fabric are sewn together. This quilt has many seams. The green arrow is pointing to a seam in fabric. The right photo is the underside of the seam. The red arrow is pointing to the seam line. It is also called the stitching line or the sewing line. This is the place that the 2 pieces of fabric are sewn together. The yellow arrow points to the seam allowance. This is the distance from the stitching line to the edge of the fabric. 3 terms you need to know: seam, seam line or stitching line, and seam allowance. Seam allowances can be wide and they can be narrow. Each seam allowance is used in a different kind of sewing. Some seams also have stitching on the edge of the seam. This is called a finished seam edge. This prevents the edges of the fabric from fraying and wearing away when it is washed. It is what you will see in seams of clothing that you buy. This is the seam on a jacket. And if I turn the seam to the other side, you can see the seam line or the stitching line. And you can see the seam allowance. This is the seam allowance, and it has a finished edge. If I measure it, it measures 3/8 of an inch. So this is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is a small quilt, like the one you're going to be making on your first project. There are many seams on this little quilt. And if I turn it over, we can see here is the stitching line. And here is the seam allowance. And if I measure this seam allowance, it is 1/2 of an inch. This is what is called a quilt block, and it has many, many seams. If I turn it over, you can see here is the seam line, and that is the seam allowance. And this seam allowance is very small. It's only 1/4 of an inch. Most quilts have 1/4 inch seams. The stitch plate on your sewing machine, this metal part right here, has lines etched onto the metal to the right of the needle. It also has lines on the left side. These are called seam guidelines. They help us make the correct size of seam allowance. Here is a close-up of the stitch plate. Notice that at the bottom of the plate, numbers are etched into the metal. The numbers 3/8 inch and 5/8 inch. The yellow arrow is pointing to these numbers. These are fractions of an inch. At the top of the stitch plate are numbers 5, 10, 15, and on the left side is number 20. These numbers are millimeters. The white arrow is pointing to them. We don't use millimeters in the United States. We will use the fraction of an inch measurements. The guidelines on the stitch plate are a measurement from the needle to the guideline. If I count the little spaces on my little ruler here, between the 1 and the 2, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces. Each space is 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to put the needle down, and the presser foot is taken off. You can leave the presser foot on if you want, just put it up. I'm going to slide this little slider on here, this orange slider, over to the first guideline. And when I see where it is on my ruler, I count 3 spaces. So this first guideline is 3/8 of an inch away from the needle. When I measure to the second line, and I lift this up, you can see that there are 4 spaces now. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is 1/2 an inch or 4/8 of an inch away from the needle. So the second guideline is the 1/2 inch line. And I'll do one more. That is to the third line. And the third line shows that I have 5 spaces. So that's 5/8 inches away from the needle. One other thing I do is I look for clues on my stitch plate to help me remember which each of these lines is. So on this stitch plate, there's a little circle right there, and that is just above my 5/8 inch seam line. And so I know that when I'm looking at this, that's the 5/8. Here's a photo of the stitch plate taken off the machine. It shows the measurements we found for each line. The first line closest to the needle makes a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The red arrow is pointing to it. The second line makes a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The yellow arrow is pointing to that. And the green arrow is pointing to the third line, which makes a 5/8 inch seam allowance. There is another line to the right of the 5/8 inch line. It is the 3/4 inch line, and the next line is the 7/8 inch line. I did not color in these last two guidelines. The 3/8 inch, the 1/2 inch, and the 5/8 inch are the most common seam allowances we use for sewing clothing and crafts. A smaller 1/4 inch seam is used to make most quilts, but the 1/4 inch is a little harder to use. We will be using the 1/2 inch seam allowance for our first quilt, so we will not take time today on how to sew a 1/4 inch seam. You may want to make a diagram of your stitch plate. I made this very rough sketch of my Bernina 335. After measuring each seam allowance guideline on the machine, I labeled each line on my drawing. I have clipped this drawing to my machine's guidebook. This is practice sheet 10-1. We will practice sewing different seam allowances now. The link to download the practice sheet is under the video description. You can watch the whole video and then do your sewing, or you can stop at intervals and sew after each demonstration. For this practice sheet, I have the machine threaded. The all-purpose foot is on the machine. We talked about the all-purpose foot in lesson 3. I have pulled the top thread tail out of the needle about 4 or 5 inches. This machine has what's called needle stop up, so every time I stop sewing, the take-up lever and the needle stops in the up position. If your machine does not have this, then you need to use the hand wheel and make sure that you start with the take-up lever at the top and the needle at the top. If your machine does not have needle stop up, then make sure that you turn your hand wheel to make sure the take-up lever and the needle are at its highest position when you start sewing. So I just threaded this machine, so if you look closely down here, you can see that the bobbin thread is not coming up through this little hole. So that's the next thing we need to do. Some newer, more expensive machines do not make you pull the bobbin thread up into that little hole before you sew, but almost all older or less expensive machines do. To bring the bobbin thread up, you're going to hold this top thread tail up in front of you a little bit with your left hand, not real tight. Then you're going to turn the hand wheel towards you until the needle and the take-up lever go all the way down and all the way back up again. And then I'm going to pull. I don't have to pull it too hard on this one. And here, right here, is a loop of the bobbin thread. Sometimes you can pull it from there, but most of the time you have to reach underneath and pull it out like that. You can use a little ruler, a little pair of scissors, some tweezers, or a pin. It doesn't really matter, but you want to make sure that that bobbin thread is coming up through that little hole right there. One more thing to do to get ready to sew, and we're going to pull the top thread into the little slit on the side of my machine. Your machine may have a slit here or here. So I'm going to take it and put it under there so that my top thread and my bobbin thread are behind the presser foot back here. Now we're going to start sewing. So you're going to get this practice sheet and you're going to look for letter A. And what we're going to do is the first line we're going to sew from A to B, and we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So on my machine, the second guideline from the needle is the 1/2 inch line. So I'm going to line this up here so that the edge of my paper is right along that 1/2 inch guideline, and I'm going to put my presser foot down. And as I sew, I'm going to hold these two threads back here to start. And you want to just hold those for the first couple stitches. And as you start, you're going to gently hold these two threads with your left hand to start your stitches every single time. This helps prevent threads going back into the bobbin area and jamming. It's an important step. As you sew, your eyes are going to look to the side of the presser foot. They're not going to be looking in front, and you're not going to be looking at the needle. And as you sew, you're going to use this guiding or steering hand on your left to help you guide that carefully. And if you need to change, you just gently guide it. You want to go slow. The faster you go, the harder it is to keep it on there. And when you get to the letter B, you're going to stop. I'm going to put up my presser foot, and I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to use my scissors, and I'm going to cut the thread close to there. And then I'm going to go back up to the top of my seam, and I'm going to cut those threads off also. If you want to, you can use the cutter that's on your machine, usually on the side, but I like to use scissors because I can get closer. And there's my first seam right there. Now we're going to start with letter B, and we're going to do a 5/8 inch seam allowance on my machine. That's the third line over, the one that has this little dot on it. So I'm going to make sure that my thread is under the presser foot. I'm going to line up with that third line, put my presser foot down. Let's start a little bit closer. There we go. And we're going to do 5/8 inch seam allowance. The same thing. Go slow. Make sure that this left hand is guiding it gently along that line, and as my paper goes back, your hand is going to go back, so you're going to have to constantly be moving it up to the front. And I am going to sew all the way to the end of this line here. So as I get close, I might try a few little stitches till I get to the end. Now I'm going to pull this out towards the back, and again I'm going to cut my threads at the end. And if you notice here, I tried to get all the way to the end of the paper right there. Then I'm going to go back up to the top, and I'm going to cut these threads off also. And my little handy plate that I keep next to me is right here for me to put those threads on. Turn it over and cut the thread. So remember, you have to cut the thread on the top and the bottom. Okay, I'm going to rotate my paper, and on this side we're going to be doing the 3/8 inch seam starting at letter C. And on my machine, that's the very first line, the closest line to the needle. So I'm going to put it down, line it up on that line, put my presser foot down, and I'm going to sew till I get to letter D. Pull it up and cut the thread on the top and the bobbin, and the same at the top of the seam. Let's look at what we just did. So this seam allowance was 1/2 inch, and as we look at the 5/8 inch, you can see that it is a lot wider. If I turn over to this side, the 3/8 inch seam is a lot narrower. Now, if you have a 1/4 inch seam on your machine and your mentor can help you find it, then you can go ahead and do the 1/4 inch here. We're not going to take the time to find a 1/4 inch today, so that's an optional one. Now the fun begins. We're going to sew a seam allowance on fabric. Sewing on paper is very different than sewing on fabric. Paper does not stretch. Fabric has stretch and give to it. When sewing fabric, we will have to do 2 layers, and this is also different than just sewing on 1 layer of paper. We will have to learn to keep the edges of these 2 fabrics together while we sew. Most of the time I'm going to use pins when sewing fabric together. We will learn to use pins in lesson 12 when we sew our quilt together. Most fabric, like this one, has 2 sides to it. This is called the right side. We don't call it the top or the front, we call it the right side. And if I turn it over, you can see that the print is not on this side. This is called the wrong side. We call them right side and wrong side. And this fabric is not printed. It is called a solid fabric. It has the same color on both sides, and that's because each of the threads in this fabric is dyed instead of the dye being put on the fabric like this on a printed fabric. And this fabric, the solid, has no right or wrong side. I'm going to put the right side of these 2 fabrics together. So I'm going to take that one and turn it over, and I'm going to lay it on there. So we call this right sides together. In a pattern, you may see the abbreviation RST, which means right sides together. I'm going to line up the edges of these fabrics at the top, like this, right there. And I'm going to line them up at the bottom. And as I look at this, I can see that I'm not having any of my bottom fabric showing through. But I'm going to turn it over, and I don't see any of my top there either. If I do, then I'm going to just move my fingers like this, scooch them over with my nails or my fingers till those are even. I'm going to start sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that's my second line, and I'm going to put my presser foot down. I'm making sure that my tails are back there, and this is where you need to make sure you're holding on to your tails when you're starting all the way to the top. And I'm making sure that my nose is in front of my needle, so I'm sitting directly in front so that I can see these lines better. And now we're going to sew. Remember that your eye is looking at the side right here so that you're guiding your fabric along that line. I'm not looking at the needle or in front of the presser foot. And I'm using this hand right here to guide. And you just do it gently. You want to stop when you get to the bottom. If your foot control is not very good, then you might need to stop and do the last few stitches with your hand wheel. When I get to the end there, I'm going to lift my presser foot up and I'm going to pull this back. Usually it's better to pull it back instead of pulling front. And then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut the top. I'm going to cut these two off right here. And I'm going to turn it to the other side and I'm going to cut the top two off. And you can look and see that I did a pretty fair half-inch seam, and on the back it looks the same. When I open these two up, you can see the seam right there, and that's two right sides together fabric. So both of these, the right side of the fabric is facing up. Okay, we're going to take two more pieces of fabric and we're going to put them right sides together. So I'm going to put those right sides together. I'm going to match up the top and I'm going to match up the bottom. I'm going to make sure that I don't see any of the back fabric there, and that side is a little off, so I'm going to push this over a little bit. And normally we would be using pins, but we're not going to learn to do pins in this lesson. And this time I'm going to do 5/8 of an inch seam. So that's my third line. Again, try to start right at the top of the fabric, and I'm going to use, I see that right down here, I'm using this hand to steer, but I'm seeing at the bottom that I'm not quite lined up, so I'm going to stop and line that up a little bit. And when I get to the end, cut my threads. And let's compare these two seams. And you will see that sewing on fabric is very different than sewing on paper. So there's my 1/2 inch and my 5/8 inch. We're going to do one more. We're going to do the same thing, but with a 3/8 of an inch seam. So I have my two fabrics here. I'm going to put them in there, line them up with the edge of this fabric on my 3/8 inch line. I'm going to hold my threads behind for just the first few stitches, and I'm going to sew along there. When I get to the end, I'm going to cut my threads. There we go, and right there. And let's compare these three seam allowances here. You can see that this 3/8 inch is kind of narrow, my 1/2 inch is a little wider, and my 5/8 inch is even wider. If you would like, you can write on each of these with a marker what seam allowance it is for your reference. And I want you to save these because we're going to use these samples when we learn how to press our seams. We're going to sew one more seam. This one is a long one. We would normally pin these two pieces together, but we're going to sew them without pins today. My pieces are not the same size. Your pieces may be the same size or may not. That is okay. This lesson is about how we use our hands on long pieces. I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam, which is my second line on here, and I'm going to put my line up there, start at the very top, make sure that these are underneath, and mine isn't, so I'm going to start again here, put that underneath there, line it up, hold on to those, and I'm going to start sewing. Now, as I sew, I want to make sure that those edges are together. So I might stop every once in a while and match them up. The thing that beginners often do when they're doing this, when they're doing really long things, is they tend to want to hold this edge right here with their hand back here. And they are kind of like they're pulling the fabric. And that is not what you want to do. As I did that, my edges weren't matched up anymore. Your hand needs to be right here, guiding into the seam allowance line, instead of holding it back here. If you're holding back here, then you're not being able to guide it. Your feed will be pushing that fabric back, and it will be pushing it back the right way. If it's going really slow and you're feeling like you need to pull on this, then maybe you need to check your stitch length. Maybe your stitch length is too small. So I'm just going to sew along here. And again, my eyes are going to be on the side where the seam allowance line is. And you can try going fast on this. And like you see how I'm kind of matching it up as I go. And I want you to go all the way to the end of my bottom one here, or your top one, whichever way it is. And again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pull this out, cut our threads at the bottom, cut our threads at the top, and we'll open up and see what this looks like. Now what I want you to do is I want you to look at your seam and the accuracy. See, I went off a little bit right there. My seam is not quite as straight right there, but it's pretty good. And that's how yours will be. Yours might be a little bit more wobbly than mine. We will learn much more about sewing seams in Lesson 12 when you sew your quilt squares together. We will talk about reverse stitches called back stitches, about things you can add to your machine to have straighter seams, and we will learn about how to use pins and how to prevent jams when you start a seam. It is time to do your homework. Show your mentor that you can do the following things. 1. What seam allowance, the fraction of an inch, is each of the lines on your stitch plate? Draw a picture of the lines and label them. 2. Sew on the practice sheet, sewing 3/8 inch, 1/2 inch, and 5/8 inch seam allowances. 3. Sew 2 pieces of fabric together, right sides together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat for a 1/2 inch and 5/8 inch seam. Sew together 2 long pieces of fabric. Measure the seams. 4. Show or describe what the right side and wrong side of a fabric is. Is the fabric printed or solid? I am so glad you finally got to sew on fabric. This is the last lesson about your sewing machine. Next time we will begin to make a quilt together. I will show you the quilt pattern we will make. We will see the different sizes and designs you can choose from. After watching Lesson 11, you and your mentor will be ready to pick fabric and lay out the quilt. Your mentor will be cutting the squares and rectangles you need for your quilt. You will learn to cut fabric on another project. I am excited that you get to make a quilt finally. See you next time. And here's a note to the mentor. My goal in these lessons is to get the students sewing as soon as possible. That is why I'm asking the mentor to provide the squares and rectangles for the quilt. You and your student will watch the next video together and decide the size you want to make. There are several sizes and several ways to lay the squares out. I will show you the options in Lesson 11. I will demonstrate laying out a quilt and how to keep track of all the pieces. There will be several handouts under the link for Lesson 11 that will help you. There are several patterns, handouts on how many squares you can cut from various cuts of fabric, coloring pages for designing your quilt, and many design ideas. If you're an older beginner without a mentor, there will be separate videos on cutting squares and buying pre-cut squares. The link to these extra videos, called Quilt Topics, will be under Lesson 11. Thank you for helping someone learn to sew.